Daphne Guinness does not do fashion. She is fashion itself, weaponized into an art form that transforms pain into beauty and survival into spectacle. Standing atop impossible heels that defy both gravity and human anatomy, her platinum and black hair cascading like a living work of art, she moves through the world's most exclusive events as if she were not merely attending them, but creating them through the sheer force of her presence. Yet behind the armor of couture and beneath the shield of avant-garde perfection lies a woman haunted by losses so profound that only the most extreme forms of beauty can contain them. This is not the story of another wealthy eccentric playing dress-up with inherited millions. This is the chronicle of a woman who discovered that when life becomes unbearable, you can either disappear into darkness or transform yourself into light so brilliant it blinds everyone to your pain. Daphne Guinness chose light, but the cost of maintaining that luminosity has been nothing less than her ability to exist as anything other than a living work of art. The mathematics of her tragedy are brutally simple. Isabella Blow, dead by suicide in 2007. Alexander McQueen, gone by his own hand in 2010. Two of the most important people in her world vanished within 3 years, leaving Daphne alone in a realm of beauty that suddenly felt more like a mausoleum than a sanctuary. The woman who had once said, "Fashion saves me from despair," found herself questioning whether fashion could save anyone from anything, or whether it merely provided elegant camouflage for the inevitable descent into darkness. What transforms mere wealth into legendary style? What drives a woman born into one of Britain's most powerful brewing dynasties to reinvent herself as a living sculpture? And what happens when the very thing that saves you also becomes the thing that isolates you from everyone who might love the person beneath the persona? But to understand how Daphne Guinness became both fashion deity and beautiful casualty, we must journey back to the privileged but turbulent world that shaped her, where money could buy anything except the one thing she would spend her life seeking: a way to transform suffering into something so beautiful that it transcended the pain that created it. The answer lies in understanding that some people are born to be canvases, while others are destined to be both the artist and the artwork, painting themselves into existence one impossible outfit at a time. Daphne Suzanne Guinness drew her first breath on November 9, 1967, into a world where privilege and eccentricity danced together like old lovers who had forgotten how to part. Born to Jonathan Guinness, heir to the brewing empire that had put Irish stout on every table in the world, and Suzanne Lisney, a woman whose own artistic aspirations would later echo in her daughter's aesthetic obsessions, Daphne entered a realm where money was never the question, only what to do with the freedom that unlimited resources could provide. The Guinness name carried weight that extended far beyond beer barrels and corporate boardrooms. This was a family that had produced politicians, philanthropists, and more than their share of beautiful eccentrics who understood that true power lay not in following social conventions, but in creating entirely new forms of existence. The Guinness legacy was one of transformation, taking simple ingredients and creating something that changed the world's taste forever. But wealth, Daphne would learn, was both blessing and burden. Growing up between estates in England, Ireland, and Spain meant never belonging entirely to any one place, never developing the deep roots that might have anchored her to conventional reality. Instead, she became a citizen of an elevated world where beauty and strangeness were not just accepted but expected, where the question was never whether you would be extraordinary but how you would choose to manifest that extraordinariness. Her childhood was spent among artworks that cost more than most people's homes, in conversations that moved effortlessly between multiple languages, surrounded by adults who treated creativity as seriously as business and beauty as seriously as politics. This was an environment that produced either remarkable artists or remarkable casualties, sometimes both in the same person. The young Daphne showed early signs of the aesthetic obsession that would define her adult life. While other children played with dolls, she created elaborate costumes for imaginary characters, transforming ordinary objects into elements of fantastical narratives. Her playmates were the paintings and sculptures that populated her family's collections, teaching her that art was not something you observed, but something you lived within. Could anyone have predicted that this privileged child would grow up to challenge every assumption about what wealth, beauty, and femininity could become? The seeds of her future transformation were already visible in her childhood preference for the strange over the safe, the challenging over the comfortable, the transcendent over the merely pretty. She was learning that in a world where you could have anything, the only real luxury was the freedom to become something unprecedented. The boarding schools that shaped her adolescence were finishing schools for the global elite, places where young women learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies of international high society. But while her classmates absorbed lessons about appropriate behavior and suitable marriage prospects, Daphne was studying something entirely different. How to use privilege as a platform for artistic expression rather than social conformity. Even as a teenager, there was something unsettling about Daphne's beauty. Too perfect, too composed, as if she were already practicing for a lifetime of being looked at rather than simply seen. She moved through these privileged spaces like someone who understood that she was destined for a form of visibility that would require her to be constantly performing, constantly creating herself anew for audiences who would never quite understand what they were witnessing. The fashion magazines that would later celebrate her were already calling to her during these formative years, not as career opportunities but as instruction manuals for transformation, showing her that the human body could be a canvas for ideas too complex for words, that clothing could be armor against a world that might otherwise consume her, that style could be a language for communicating truths too dangerous to speak aloud. By the time she reached young adulthood, Daphne Guinness had developed into something unprecedented. A woman who understood that her greatest inheritance was not money but the freedom to reinvent the very concept of what a person could become. The question was no longer what she would do with her privilege, but what her privilege would do to her. And to everyone who encountered the magnificent, terrifying artwork she was about to become. The transformation from privileged young woman to fashion revolution began not in the studios of great designers but in the looking glass of her own bathroom, where Daphne first discovered that her reflection could be edited, revised, and ultimately rewritten into something that transcended the limitations of mere human beauty. The process was alchemical, taking the raw materials of bone structure, skin, and hair, and transmuting them into something that existed somewhere between sculpture and sorcery. Her early experiments with self-presentation were not about following trends, but about creating entirely new categories of visual experience. While her contemporaries in London's social scene dressed to fit in, Daphne dressed to stand apart, not through ostentation but through a kind of calculated otherworldliness that made viewers question whether they were looking at a person or witnessing a living artwork step out of its frame. The platinum and black hair that would become her signature was not a fashion choice but a philosophical statement. The marriage of ice and shadow, purity and darkness, heaven and hell coexisting in perfect, impossible harmony. Achieving this look required hours of chemical processing that left her scalp raw and her hair brittle, but the visual impact was worth any amount of physical discomfort. Beauty, she was learning, was not about comfort, but about transformation. Her shoe collection began during this period as well. Not the sensible heels expected of a young woman of her background, but towering architectural impossibilities that forced her to relearn how to walk, how to stand, how to exist in space. Each pair was a challenge to the laws of physics and human anatomy, platforms that elevated her not just physically but conceptually, placing her in a realm where normal rules no longer applied. The fashion world first noticed Daphne not because she was wealthy but because she was doing something unprecedented with that wealth, using it to fund her own transformation into a living work of art. While other society figures hired stylists to make them look appropriate, Daphne was developing her own aesthetic language, one that spoke fluently in the grammar of avant-garde fashion while remaining entirely personal and unrepeatable. Was this early commitment to extreme beauty a form of artistic expression or an elaborate form of self-protection? The question became more complex as Daphne began attracting attention from actual fashion professionals, who recognized in her something they had never seen before. A woman who understood fashion not as decoration but as a form of armor, not as vanity, but as a survival mechanism. Her first appearances at fashion events were revelatory. Here was someone who didn't simply wear clothes but inhabited them, who transformed every outfit into a performance piece and every public appearance into an art installation. The fashion press, always hungry for new forms of spectacle, found in Daphne something unprecedented. Authentic avant-garde sensibility backed by unlimited resources and an apparent willingness to suffer for her art. The early magazine shoots that featured her were exercises in mutual fascination. Photographers discovered that Daphne photographed like no one they had ever worked with, not because she was more beautiful than other models or more experienced than other subjects, but because she seemed to understand instinctively that the camera was not capturing her, but capturing the idea of her. The concept of beauty pushed beyond conventional boundaries into realms that were both thrilling and slightly terrifying. During this period, Daphne also began her lifelong practice of collecting not just clothing but relationships with the artists who created the most challenging and innovative work in fashion. She sought out designers who were pushing boundaries, who were treating fashion as a form of conceptual art rather than commercial product. These relationships would become the foundation for everything that followed. Friendships that were as much about mutual artistic inspiration as they were about personal affection. The woman emerging from these formative years was no longer simply Daphne Guinness, brewery heiress. She was becoming something unprecedented, a person who had used wealth and privilege not to purchase safety and comfort but to buy the freedom to become dangerous, to challenge every assumption about what femininity, beauty, and fashion could accomplish when pushed to their absolute limits. The collision that would define everything came through Isabella Blow, the legendary stylist whose eye for revolutionary talent was matched only by her capacity for self-destruction. When Isabella first encountered Daphne at a London fashion event in the early 2000s, she saw immediately what others had missed. Here was not just another wealthy woman playing dress-up, but a genuine artist who had chosen her own body as her primary medium and fashion as her native language. Isabella, who had discovered Alexander McQueen and nurtured his early career, recognized in Daphne a kindred spirit, someone who understood that fashion could be a form of rebellion, that beauty could be a weapon, and that the most powerful art often emerged from the deepest wounds. Their friendship became one of mutual recognition. Two women who had chosen to live dangerously in a world that preferred its females safe and decorative. Under Isabella's influence, Daphne's aesthetic evolution accelerated dramatically. Where she had once been experimental, she became revolutionary. Where she had been striking, she became impossible to ignore. Isabella taught her that true style was not about wearing beautiful things, but about becoming something so beautiful and strange that it changed how people understood the very concept of human presentation. The collaboration between them produced some of the most iconic fashion moments of the decade. When they appeared together at events, they created a kind of visual earthquake that left other attendees struggling to process what they had witnessed. Here were two women who had rejected every conventional notion of appropriate female behavior and created their own universe where impossible was just another word for Tuesday. But Isabella's influence extended beyond fashion into darker territories. She introduced Daphne to the concept that beauty could be a form of armor against despair, that transforming oneself into art could provide protection against the kinds of pain that ordinary human defenses could not withstand. This lesson would prove both salvation and curse as Daphne's life unfolded. Alexander McQueen entered this constellation as both student and teacher, a designer whose vision matched the extremity of their aesthetic ambitions. Lee, as his friends called him, shared their understanding that fashion was not decoration but transformation, not comfort, but challenge. His designs for both women pushed the boundaries of what clothing could accomplish, treating the human body as a canvas for ideas too complex and disturbing for conventional art forms. The triangle of friendship between Daphne, Isabella, and Lee became one of the most creatively fertile relationships in fashion history. They fed off each other's willingness to go further, to push harder, to transform pain into beauty and beauty into something that transcended conventional categories. Together, they created a world where fashion became philosophy, where getting dressed was an act of rebellion, where every public appearance was a manifesto written in fabric and flesh. Behind all that creative intensity was there a growing awareness that they were playing a dangerous game. The line between transformation and self-destruction is often invisible until it has been crossed, and all three of them were walking that line with the fearless dedication of true artists. They were creating something unprecedented, but the cost of such creation was beginning to accumulate in ways that none of them fully understood. During this period, Daphne's apartment became a kind of laboratory for aesthetic experimentation. Every surface, every object, every detail was curated with the same obsessive attention she brought to her own appearance. Visitors described entering a space that felt more like stepping inside someone's imagination than visiting their home, a place where reality had been edited according to principles of beauty and strangeness that operated by their own internal logic. The work they were doing together was not just about making beautiful things, but about proving that human beings could remake themselves according to their own vision, rather than accepting the limitations imposed by nature or society. They were living proof that with enough will, enough resources, and enough disregard for conventional boundaries, a person could become something entirely new, something that had never existed before and might never exist again. The financial mathematics of Daphne's transformation were staggering. Custom couture pieces that cost more than luxury cars, shoes handcrafted by artists who treated each pair as a sculpture, beauty treatments that required flying specialists in from around the world. But the real cost was not measured in money, but in the gradual erosion of any distinction between the person and the persona, between Daphne Guinness, the human being, and Daphne Guinness, the living artwork. As her reputation spread throughout the international fashion world, Daphne found herself becoming something unprecedented, a person who existed primarily as a visual experience rather than a social one. People encountered her not as someone to have conversations with, but as someone to witness, to photograph, to try to understand through observation rather than interaction. The armor of beauty that protected her from the world also isolated her within it. Yet during these years of creative explosion, there was an undeniable sense that something magical was happening. The three of them, Daphne, Isabella, and Lee, were creating a new form of human expression, proving that fashion could be as profound and challenging as any traditional art form. They were living their art rather than simply making it, becoming the message they wanted to communicate to a world that desperately needed to see new possibilities for human existence. The question that would haunt everything that followed was whether such intensity could be sustained. whether art that demanded everything from its creators could coexist with the basic human need for connection, stability, and peace. They were about to discover that some forms of beauty exact prices that even unlimited wealth cannot afford to pay. The first crack in their perfect world appeared not as dramatic collapse, but as subtle darkening around the edges like shadows creeping across a magnificent painting. Isabella Blow, the woman who had taught Daphne that fashion could be armor against despair, was discovering that even the most beautiful armor had limits. Her struggles with depression, financial pressures, and the industry that consumed her creativity while offering little in return began manifesting in ways that terrified those who loved her. Daphne watched helplessly as her mentor and friend began to fragment under pressures that seemed to have no solution. Isabella's battle with mental illness was complicated by her position in the fashion world, where vulnerability was seen as weakness and asking for help was considered unprofessional. The same industry that celebrated her eye for revolutionary talent offered no support when she needed it most, treating her as disposable despite her irreplaceable contributions. The fashion world's response to Isabella's deteriorating condition revealed its true nature. A beautiful, brilliant woman was disappearing before everyone's eyes, yet the machine continued operating as if nothing were wrong. Shows went on, magazines were published, careers advanced, while one of the most important figures in contemporary fashion slowly lost her ability to function in the world she had helped create. Did this tragedy mark the beginning of the end? Or was it simply the moment when Daphne first understood the true cost of transforming oneself into art? When Isabella died by suicide in 2007, taking a deliberate overdose at Gloucester Royal Hospital, she left behind a void that could never be filled and questions that would haunt Daphne for the rest of her life. If fashion was supposed to be armor against despair, why hadn't it protected the person who understood it best? Isabella's death sent shockwaves through the fashion establishment, but the industry's response was telling. There were beautiful memorial services and touching tributes, but little examination of the systemic issues that had contributed to her despair. The fashion world preferred to remember Isabella as a tragic genius rather than confront the possibility that its own treatment of creative people might be partially responsible for such losses. For Daphne, Isabella's death was both personal devastation and philosophical crisis. The woman who had taught her that beauty could save you had been unable to save herself. The armor of couture that had protected them both had proved inadequate against the particular forms of pain that contemporary life could inflict. If fashion was not actually protective, then what was Daphne transforming herself into, and why? The period following Isabella's death saw Daphne retreat into even more extreme forms of aesthetic expression, as if by pushing further into the realm of pure visual spectacle she could somehow honor Isabella's memory, or avoid Isabella's fate. Her appearances became more elaborate, her persona more armored, her separation from ordinary human experience more complete. She was not just mourning a friend, but defending against the possibility that she might suffer the same fate. Alexander McQueen's response to Isabella's death was equally intense but manifested differently. His designs became darker, more complex, more challenging to both wearers and viewers. The collections he produced in the years following Isabella's suicide were masterpieces of technical achievement and emotional intensity, but they also revealed a man grappling with profound questions about the value and cost of creating beauty in a world that seemed determined to destroy its most sensitive inhabitants. The friendship between Daphne and Lee deepened during this period, bonded not just by shared aesthetic vision, but by shared loss and shared understanding of the dangers inherent in their chosen forms of existence. They became each other's witnesses and protectors, the only people in their orbits who truly understood what it meant to live as living artworks in a world that was often hostile to such ambitions. But even their mutual support could not shield them from the realization that Isabella's death had revealed something fundamental about the fashion world, and perhaps about the nature of extreme aesthetic commitment itself. They were operating in a realm where the line between transcendence and self-destruction was often invisible, where the very qualities that made someone extraordinary also made them extraordinarily vulnerable. Daphne's public appearances during this period took on a different quality, more ritualistic, more ceremonial, as if each outfit and each event were not just aesthetic statements, but memorial services for Isabella and warnings about the price of beauty. She was no longer simply being beautiful. She was bearing witness to beauty's capacity for both salvation and destruction. The question that haunted both Daphne and Lee was whether they could continue their artistic evolution without succumbing to the forces that had claimed Isabella. They had proven that human beings could transform themselves into living art. But Isabella's death suggested that such transformation might exact costs that even the most dedicated artists could not afford to pay. The armor of beauty that had once felt protective was beginning to feel more like a trap. Beautiful, but potentially fatal. The second blow came with devastating swiftness, arriving on February 11, 2010, when Alexander McQueen's housekeeper found his body hanging in his Mayfair apartment, a suicide that sent shockwaves through the fashion world and shattered what remained of Daphne's faith in beauty as protection. Lee's death, coming just 3 years after Isabella's, transformed what had seemed like isolated tragedy into undeniable pattern. The most visionary artists in fashion were destroying themselves at an alarming rate. The circumstances of Lee's death were particularly cruel. He had just presented his final collection, Plato's Atlantis, a magnificent meditation on evolution and transformation that seemed to prophesy his own disappearance. The man who had spent his career turning human bodies into canvases for impossible beauty had ultimately been unable to find a canvas large enough to contain his own pain. The fashion world lost its most fearless visionary just as he was reaching new heights of artistic achievement. For Daphne, Lee's suicide was not just personal loss but existential crisis. In the span of 3 years, she had lost the two people who best understood her commitment to living as art, who had shared her belief that transformation could be salvation, who had proven that human beings could transcend conventional limitations through sheer force of aesthetic will. If they could not survive in the world they had created, what hope did she have? The fashion establishment's response to Lee's death followed familiar patterns: beautiful tributes, touching memorial services, and careful avoidance of the systemic issues that might have contributed to his despair. The industry that had profited from his genius preferred to remember him as a tortured artist rather than examine whether its own demands and pressures had played a role in his decision to end his life. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of such devastating losses? Daphne's immediate response was to retreat even further into the realm of pure aesthetic experience, as if by becoming more completely a work of art she could somehow transcend the human vulnerabilities that had claimed her friends. Her appearances became more elaborate, more armor-like, more disconnected from ordinary human interaction. The apartment she had shared creative energy with Lee and Isabella became a kind of shrine to their memory and their shared vision. Every object, every surface, every detail was curated not just for beauty but as memorial to the people who had taught her that fashion could be a form of philosophy, that clothing could be a language for ideas too complex for words, that the human body could be transformed into something that challenged every assumption about what people could become. But preserving their legacy also meant preserving their isolation. The more completely Daphne embodied their shared aesthetic vision, the more she separated herself from the kinds of human connections that might have provided comfort or stability. She was becoming a living museum of their ideas, beautiful and inspiring, but increasingly removed from the world of ordinary human experience. During this period, Daphne's relationship with fashion shifted from expression to obsession, from choice to compulsion. Getting dressed each day became not just an aesthetic decision, but a ritual of survival, a way of honoring the dead while protecting herself from their fate. The clothing that had once been liberation was becoming a kind of beautiful prison, necessary for her psychological survival but isolating her from everyone who might have loved the person beneath the persona. The financial resources that had once funded creative experimentation now served a different purpose, maintaining the elaborate structure of beauty and transformation that had become essential to her continued existence. The costs were not just monetary but psychological. The constant vigilance required to maintain such an extreme aesthetic, the physical discomfort of impossible shoes and elaborate costumes, the social isolation that came from being perceived more as art object than as human being. Yet abandoning this path seemed impossible. To step back from the extreme aesthetic commitment would mean betraying Isabella and Lee's memory, admitting that their shared vision had been wrong, acknowledging that beauty could not in fact protect against the kinds of pain that life could inflict. The choice seemed to be between continuing forward into ever greater extremes of aesthetic transformation or surrendering to the possibility that their entire project had been a beautiful mistake. The question that haunted her was whether it was possible to live as a work of art without ultimately sharing the fate of the artists who had created her. Isabella and Lee had proven that the most extraordinary forms of human expression often emerged from the deepest wounds, but they had also demonstrated that such wounds might ultimately prove fatal. Daphne was left to discover whether their vision could survive its creators, whether she could continue their work without succumbing to their despair. The years following Alexander McQueen's death transformed Daphne's apartment into something unprecedented. A living museum dedicated not just to fashion but to the memory of friendship, creativity, and the dangerous pursuit of beauty pushed beyond all conventional limits. Every room became a shrine to artistic vision and personal loss, curated with the same obsessive attention to detail that she brought to her own appearance, a space where grief and glamour coexisted in perfect, impossible harmony. The transformation was both aesthetic and psychological. Daphne surrounded herself with the artifacts of her friendships with Isabella and Lee, pieces from their collections, photographs from their collaborations, objects that carried the weight of shared creative moments. But these memorial objects served a dual purpose, honoring the dead while creating a buffer between Daphne and a world that had proven itself capable of destroying the people she loved most. Her public appearances during this period took on the quality of religious ceremonies, each outfit a form of prayer, each event an opportunity to bear witness to the vision she had shared with Isabella and Lee. The elaborate costumes and impossible shoes were no longer just aesthetic choices, but acts of devotion, ways of keeping their shared understanding of fashion as philosophy alive in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to such extremes. When Lee left, part of me died too, she confided to friends during this period, and the statement carried both literal and metaphorical truth. The part of her that had believed in fashion as salvation, that had trusted in beauty as protection, that had faith in transformation as transcendence, that part had indeed died with him. What remained was a more complex, more guarded version of herself, someone who continued the work while questioning its ultimate value. The elaborate beauty rituals that had once been joyful experimentation became more like spiritual practices, ways of maintaining connection to something larger than herself, while protecting against the despair that had claimed her friends. The hours spent achieving the perfect hair, the perfect makeup, the perfect impossible silhouette were hours spent in meditation on loss, transformation, and the price of living as art. Were these final performances acts of devotion, or simply the only way she knew how to continue existing? The question became more urgent as Daphne found herself increasingly isolated by her own aesthetic choices. The armor of beauty that protected her from the world also separated her from potential sources of comfort and connection. She was becoming a prisoner of her own magnificence, trapped within a persona that had become essential to her survival. During this period, she also began speaking more openly about the psychological cost of extreme aesthetic commitment, revealing in interviews the extent to which maintaining her image required sacrificing ordinary human pleasures and connections. "Couture is my armor," she explained, "but armor is heavy, and sometimes I wonder what I might have been if I had chosen to be unprotected." The fashion world's response to her continued presence was complex and often contradictory. She was celebrated as a living legend, a keeper of avant-garde tradition, a woman who had refused to compromise her vision despite devastating losses. Yet she was also viewed as something of a cautionary tale, a reminder of the potential costs of taking aesthetic commitment too far, a beautiful relic of a more extreme era in fashion history. Her influence on younger designers and artists remained profound, but it was an influence tinged with warning as well as inspiration. She had proven that human beings could transform themselves into living art, but she had also demonstrated the isolation and vulnerability that such transformation could entail. The students who studied her work learned not just about pushing aesthetic boundaries, but about the personal costs of crossing them. The documentary projects and museum exhibitions that began featuring her work during this period struggled with a fundamental question. Was Daphne Guinness an artist whose medium happened to be fashion, or was she a person who had disappeared so completely into aesthetic performance that only the performance remained? The distinction mattered because it determined whether her life represented triumph or tragedy, whether her example should inspire emulation or serve as warning. As she entered what might be called the institutional phase of her career, the period when living legends begin to be treated as cultural artifacts rather than active creators, Daphne faced the challenge of maintaining her edge while accepting her role as guardian of a particular aesthetic vision. The woman who had once been revolutionary was becoming historical, which meant finding new ways to remain dangerous in a world that increasingly wanted to celebrate her safely from a distance. In the quiet moments between public appearances, surrounded by the beautiful objects that commemorated her friendships with Isabella and Lee, Daphne continued to grapple with the fundamental questions their deaths had raised. Whether beauty could truly protect against despair, whether transformation could provide genuine escape from human limitations, whether the art they had created together had been worth the price it had exacted from its creators. The answers remained elusive, hidden somewhere between the feathers and diamonds, the impossible shoes and the perfect hair, the armor of couture and the vulnerability it was designed to protect. The final act of Daphne Guinness's story continues to unfold in real time, but its trajectory has become tragically clear. She has chosen to live as a breathing monument to the dangerous intersection of wealth, creativity, and the fashion industry's systematic failure to protect its most vulnerable visionaries. In a world that has largely abandoned the extreme aesthetic ambitions she shared with Isabella and Lee, she remains their sole surviving apostle, proof that the philosophy of fashion as armor can sustain life even when it cannot guarantee happiness. What hidden truths about the relationship between beauty and survival remain unexplored in her ongoing story? The question becomes more pressing as the fashion industry continues to consume young talent while offering insufficient support for the mental health crises that often accompany creative genius. Daphne's example serves as both inspiration and indictment, proof that transformation is possible but also evidence of the prices such transformation exacts from those who pursue it. Her legacy extends beyond fashion into fundamental questions about the nature of artistic commitment, the relationship between privilege and creativity, and the possibility of using extreme aesthetic choices as both expression and protection. She has proven that human beings can remake themselves according to their own vision when unlimited resources meet absolute dedication, but she has also demonstrated that such remaking comes with forms of isolation that may be harder to bear than the original pain it was designed to escape. The young people who encounter her work today, whether through museum exhibitions, documentary films, or carefully curated social media presence, witness something that may not be repeatable. A person who transformed unlimited financial resources and bottomless aesthetic commitment into a living experiment in the limits of beauty as psychological armor. Whether they see her as role model or cautionary tale depends on their own relationship to risk, transformation, and the question of whether any form of protection is worth complete separation from ordinary human experience. The fashion industry that created the conditions for Isabella's and Lee's destruction continues to operate largely unchanged, still celebrating genius while providing inadequate support for the psychological costs of extreme creativity. Daphne's continued presence serves as a living reminder of what happens to the survivors, those who remain after the system has claimed its casualties, who must find ways to honor the dead while protecting themselves from similar fates. The morning light that streams through the windows of her carefully curated spaces illuminates not just beautiful objects, but the ongoing experiment of a life lived as aesthetic statement and memorial service combined. Daphne Guinness continues to prove daily that fashion can be philosophy, that beauty can be resistance, that wealth can fund transformation into something unprecedented, but she also demonstrates that such achievements may require sacrificing the very humanity they were designed to protect and celebrate. Her story serves as a mirror reflecting the fashion industry's relationship with its creators. It will celebrate their vision, profit from their innovation, and memorialize their genius, but it struggles to provide the kinds of basic human support that might prevent tragedy. The armor of beauty that Daphne has constructed around herself is both artistic achievement and survival mechanism, both tribute to lost friends and barrier against joining them in whatever darkness finally claimed them. The question that will define her ultimate legacy is not whether the vision she preserves is beautiful, that has already been established beyond doubt. The question is whether beauty alone is sufficient foundation for a human life, whether transformation can provide genuine protection or only elaborate camouflage, and whether the fashion industry will learn from the casualties it has created or continue to consume its visionaries while celebrating their sacrifices as inevitable artistic tragedy. In a world increasingly suspicious of extremes and committed to mental health awareness, Daphne Guinness stands as both artifact and warning. A woman who achieved something unprecedented by using fashion as existential armor, but who paid prices that are still being calculated with each impossible shoe, each perfect styling, each public appearance that maintains the beautiful barrier between herself and a world that proved itself capable of destroying everyone she loved most.